July 14th, 1941. The Eastern Front is barely 3 weeks old, and German panzer units are rolling through Soviet territory like an unstoppable steel wave. Wehrmacht officers are confident, maybe even arrogant, believing the Red Army lacks the technology and tactical sophistication to mount effective resistance. In the small town of Rudnya, near Smolensk, a German mechanized column pulls into the marketplace for a routine resupply stop. Trucks, half-tracks, and tanks crowd the central square, while soldiers dismount to stretch their legs and redistribute ammunition. Nobody expects what's about to happen. Hidden in the forest tree line 3 kilometers away, Captain Ivan Florov checks his watch one final time. His experimental artillery battery consists of 7 strange-looking vehicles, modified ZIS-6 trucks mounting rail launchers loaded with 132mm rockets. The weapon is so secret that NKVD troops guard it, with orders to destroy the launchers if capture seems imminent. Florov's finger hovers over the firing mechanism. In exactly 15 seconds, everything the Germans think they know about Soviet military capability is about to change forever. If this story amazes you, hit that like button, subscribe for more untold WWII history, and comment below which Eastern Front battle we should cover next. The morning sun cuts through the pine trees surrounding Rudnya as Oberst Friedrich Müller supervises the resupply operation in the town's central marketplace. His boots crunching across cobblestones that had been undisturbed by warfare until 3 days ago, when Wehrmacht forces captured this strategically insignificant town during their relentless advance toward Moscow. The marketplace stretches roughly 200 meters across, bordered by wooden buildings that Soviet forces abandoned without a fight, leaving behind only burned documents and the lingering smell of diesel fuel from destroyed supply trucks. Müller counts 37 vehicles crowded into the square, a mixed column from the 78th Infantry Division including 8 SDKFZ 251 half-tracks, 12 Opel Blitz supply trucks, 4 Panzer III tanks that need track maintenance, and various support vehicles carrying ammunition, fuel, and rations for the next push eastward. His men move with the casual confidence of soldiers who've been winning continuously for 3 weeks straight. Private Hans Dietrich, a 22-year-old mechanic from Bavaria, works underneath a half-track's transmission, wrench in hand, grease staining his field gray uniform as he complains to his assistant about the quality of replacement parts being shipped from Germany. Nearby, a group of infantry soldiers share cigarettes and speculate about when they'll reach Moscow, most betting they'll be there before August ends, maybe even celebrating in Red Square by the Führer's birthday. Lieutenant Ernst Weber coordinates the fuel distribution from his position near the eastern edge of the marketplace, clipboard in hand, checking off vehicles as they receive their allotment from the tanker truck that arrived from the rear echelon an hour ago. Nobody has established proper defensive positions because intelligence reports indicate the nearest Soviet units are at least 15 kilometers east, retreating in disorder toward Smolensk. The Luftwaffe conducted reconnaissance flights over this sector yesterday afternoon and reported nothing but scattered Red Army stragglers and abandoned equipment. Standard Wehrmacht doctrine for supply stops in recently captured territory calls for security patrols on the perimeter and at least 1 vehicle-mounted MG-34 machine gun positioned for area defense. But Müller judges the situation secure enough that he's allowed his men to relax and conduct maintenance without full tactical protocols. That decision, based on 3 weeks of easy victories against a disorganized enemy, will haunt him for the rest of his life. 3 kilometers to the southwest, concealed in a dense birch forest that provides perfect overhead cover from aerial observation, Captain Ivan Florov of the Red Army's experimental rocket artillery battery completes his final pre-firing checklist at 08:15 hours. His 7 BM-13 Katyusha rocket launchers sit in carefully surveyed firing positions, each vehicle precisely oriented on coordinates that Florov's forward observer had marked on his map 2 hours earlier when German forces first began concentrating in Rudnya's marketplace. The BM-13 represents Soviet weapons development at its most innovative and terrifying. a simple rail launcher system mounted on a standard ZIS-6 trunk that can fire 16 132mm rockets in a single salvo with a maximum range exceeding 8,500 meters. Each rocket weighs 42 kilograms and carries a 4.9 kilogram high explosive fragmentation warhead designed to detonate on impact, sending hundreds of steel fragments in a 30-meter radius that can shred human bodies and penetrate light armor. The launcher's true revolutionary capability lies not in the individual rocket's destructive power, but in the massed effect. 7 launchers firing simultaneously can deliver 112 rockets onto a target area in approximately 15 seconds, creating a density of explosions that exceeds anything conventional artillery can achieve. Florov walks between his launchers, checking each firing circuit one final time, his hands steady despite knowing that this will be the weapon's first combat employment and that nobody, not the designers, not the artillery specialists at the People's Commissariat of Armaments, not even Stalin himself, knows exactly how effective it will be under actual battlefield conditions. The morning sun cuts through the pine trees surrounding Rudnya as Oberst Friedrich Müller supervises the resupply operation in the town's central marketplace, his boots crunching across cobblestones that had been undisturbed by warfare until 3 days ago, when Wehrmacht forces captured this strategically insignificant town during their relentless advance toward Moscow. The marketplace stretches roughly 200 meters across, bordered by wooden buildings that Soviet forces abandoned without a fight, leaving behind only burned documents and the lingering smell of diesel fuel from destroyed supply trucks. Müller counts 37 vehicles crowded into the square, a mixed column from the 78th Infantry Division, including 8 SDKFC 251 half-tracks, 12 Opel Blitz supply trucks, 4 Panzer III tanks that need track maintenance, and various support vehicles carrying ammunition, fuel, and rations for the next push eastward. His men move with the casual confidence of soldiers who've been winning continuously for 3 weeks straight. Private Hans Dietrich, a 22-year-old mechanic from Bavaria, works underneath a half-track's transmission, wrench in hand, grease staining his field gray uniform as he complains to his assistant about the quality of replacement parts being shipped from Germany. Nearby, a group of infantry soldiers share cigarettes and speculate about when they'll reach Moscow, most betting they'll be there before August ends, maybe even celebrating in Red Square by the Führer's birthday. Lieutenant Ernst Weber coordinates the fuel distribution from his position near the eastern edge of the marketplace, clipboard in hand, checking off vehicles as they receive their allotment from the tanker truck that arrived from the rear echelon an hour ago. Nobody has established proper defensive positions because intelligence reports indicate the nearest Soviet units are at least 15 kilometers east, retreating in disorder towards Smolensk. The Luftwaffe conducted reconnaissance flights over this sector yesterday afternoon and reported nothing but scattered Red Army stragglers and abandoned equipment. Standard Wehrmacht doctrine for supply stops in recently captured territory calls for security patrols on the perimeter and at least one vehicle-mounted MG-34 machine gun positioned for area defense. But Müller judges the situation secure enough that he's allowed his men to relax and conduct maintenance without full tactical protocols. That decision, based on 3 weeks of easy victories against a disorganized enemy, will haunt him for the rest of his life. 3 kilometers to the southwest, concealed in a dense birch forest that provides perfect overhead cover from aerial observation, Captain Ivan Florov of the Red Army's Experimental Rocket Artillery Battery completes his final pre-firing checklist at 0815 hours. His 7 BM-13 Katyusha rocket launchers sit in carefully surveyed firing positions, each vehicle precisely oriented on coordinates that Florov's forward observer had marked on his map 2 hours earlier when German forces first began concentrating in Rudnya's marketplace. The BM-13 represents Soviet weapons development at its most innovative and terrifying, a simple rail launcher system mounted on a standard ZIS-6 truck that can fire 16 132mm rockets in a single salvo with a maximum range exceeding 8,500 meters.
Each rocket weighs 42 kilograms and carries a 4.9 kilogram high-explosive fragmentation warhead designed to detonate on impact, sending hundreds of steel fragments in a 30-meter radius that can shred human bodies and penetrate light armor. The launcher's true revolutionary capability lies not in the individual rocket's destructive power, but in the massed effect. 7 launchers firing simultaneously can deliver 112 rockets onto a target area in approximately 15 seconds, creating a density of explosions that exceeds anything conventional artillery can achieve. Florov walks between his launchers, checking each firing circuit one final time, his hands steady despite knowing that this will be the weapon's first combat employment, and that nobody, not the designers, not the artillery specialists at the People's Commissariat of Armaments, not even Stalin himself, knows exactly how effective it will be under actual battlefield conditions.
The sound begins before the rockets arrive. A rising wail that starts as a distant whistle and builds into a demonic shriek that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, like 1,000 banshees descending from the sky. Oberst Miller's head snaps upward, his trained military instincts recognizing incoming fire, even though he's never heard anything like this distinctive sound before. The scream builds in intensity for exactly 3.7 seconds, the time it takes for 132mm rockets traveling at 355 meters per second to cover the 3,000-meter distance from Flyorov's launchers to the marketplace. Then the first impacts begin. 16 rockets from the lead BM-13 launcher strike the marketplace in a ragged pattern that covers approximately 40 square meters, each warhead detonating with a sharp crack that sends fragmentation in expanding spheres of death. The Opel Blitz truck carrying ammunition explodes in a secondary detonation that sends burning debris 50 meters into the air. The half-track that Private Dietrich was working underneath flips onto its side as a rocket impact lifts the vehicle's rear end and drops it sideways, crushing Dietrich beneath 2 tons of armored steel. Lieutenant Weber vanishes in a direct rocket hit that leaves nothing identifiable enough to require burial. But the first salvo is just the beginning. 7 more salvos arrive in rapid succession over the next 12 seconds as the remaining BM-13 launchers empty their rails in coordinated sequence. The marketplace transforms into a vision of industrial-scale destruction that exceeds anything in Wehrmacht combat experience. 96 additional rockets impact in overlapping patterns that ensure complete coverage of the target area. Each explosion creates a pressure wave that shatters windows and buildings 100 meters away and ruptures eardrums of anyone within 50 meters. The fragmentation patterns intersect and overlap, creating a horizontal steel storm that cuts through human bodies like invisible blades and perforates vehicle hulls with thousands of puncture wounds. Fire spreads instantly as fuel tanks rupture, and burning diesel creates rivers of flame that flow between vehicles and ignite everything combustible. The Panzer III tanks survive the fragmentation, but their external equipment, vision blocks, antenna mounts, tool stowage, anything protruding from the armored hull is shredded by the thousands of steel fragments that ricochet off the armor in cascading sparks. Soldiers caught in the open simply cease to exist. A 3-man machine gun crew positioned on the marketplace's eastern edge is found later with wounds from 17 separate fragmentation hits distributed across their bodies, none individually fatal but collectively catastrophic. The battalion medical officer, Captain Werner Schmidt, survives by diving into a cellar entrance as the first rockets impact, but emerges to find casualties that exceed anything his medical training prepared him for. Men with limbs severed by fragmentation, abdomens opened by high-velocity steel fragments, faces burned beyond recognition by diesel fires, and the distinctive psychological shock of soldiers who experienced overwhelming violence that their minds cannot process. The entire attack, from first rocket impact to final detonation lasts exactly 14.8 seconds. In that brief interval, Soviet rocket artillery delivers more explosive tonnage onto the marketplace than a conventional artillery battalion could fire in 20 minutes. The silence after the barrage feels almost as violent as the attack itself. A sudden absence of sound, broken only by the crackling of fires, the screams of wounded soldiers, and the metallic pinging of hot metal cooling in the morning air. Miller pulls himself from behind the stone wall where he'd thrown himself during the first impacts, his ears ringing from multiple nearby explosions, his vision still spotted from the flash of dozens of detonations. What he sees destroys any confidence he'd felt about German military superiority. The marketplace has been transformed into a scene of apocalyptic destruction. 23 vehicles are burning or destroyed outright. The ammunition truck continues exploding in secondary detonations that send tracers and shell fragments whistling through the air in random directions. Bodies and body parts are scattered across the cobblestones in patterns that make identifying individuals impossible. The wounded, and there are dozens of them, cry out for medics who cannot reach them through the fires and unexploded ordnance. Müller counts approximately 80 men still standing or capable of movement out of the 180 who'd been in the marketplace when the attack began. But even more disturbing than the physical casualties is the look on the survivors' faces, a blank, shocked expression that Müller recognizes from his experiences in France as the face of men who've encountered something beyond their comprehension.
German infantry training emphasizes discipline under artillery fire, teaches soldiers to take cover and accept that some casualties are inevitable, but the unit will survive and continue fighting. This was something fundamentally different. This was industrial-scale violence, delivered with such speed and intensity that human reflexes couldn't respond and conventional defensive measures couldn't protect. Wehrmacht tactical doctrine assumes artillery batteries require 5 to 10 minutes to range in on targets, providing time for units to disperse or take cover. These rockets had arrived with zero warning beyond that 3-second wail. Doctrine assumes artillery impacts will be dispersed across time as individual guns fire in sequence, allowing personnel to move between impacts. These rockets had arrived in a single devastating wave that gave no opportunity for evasive action. Most disturbing of all, doctrine assumes that artillery fire can be suppressed by counter-battery missions once German observers identify enemy gun positions. But Müller has no idea where these weapons fired from. The forest stretches for kilometers in every direction, and the rockets left no visible trajectory traces like conventional artillery shells. Hauptmann Klaus Zimmermann, the senior surviving officer from the 78th Infantry Division's regimental staff, establishes a casualty collection point in a building on the marketplace's western edge and begins organizing the survivors into functioning units. His official after-action report, filed 3 days later after the survivors reached German lines, provides the first detailed Wehrmacht documentation of Soviet rocket artillery capabilities. Enemy-employed unknown weapon system, believed to be multiple rocket launchers capable of delivering massed fires with extreme rapidity and psychological effect. Conventional artillery countermeasures ineffective due to inability to locate firing positions and extreme speed of launcher displacement. Recommend immediate tactical adjustment for all units operating in range of suspected rocket batteries, including mandatory dispersion of vehicle columns, prohibition of stationary concentrations exceeding 10 vehicles, and development of countermeasures against this threat. But Zimmermann's clinical military language cannot capture the deeper impact of what happened at Rudnya. For 3 weeks, Wehrmacht forces had advanced through Soviet territory against an enemy that seemed incapable of coordinated resistance or effective use of heavy weapons. German soldiers had developed a dangerous confidence that Soviet military technology lagged years behind German capabilities, and that Red Army units could be defeated through superior training and tactics.
The Katyusha strike shattered those assumptions in 15 seconds. Soviet weapons designers had created something that changed the tactical calculation, a weapon system that delivered overwhelming firepower with such speed and shock that conventional defensive measures became irrelevant. As survivors from Müller's column straggle back toward German lines over the next 6 hours, they carry with them not just physical wounds, but a new fear that will spread through Wehrmacht ranks like a virus. The fear of that distinctive rising wail that signals incoming destruction against which no armor can fully protect and no courage can overcome. The fear that the Red Army, written off as beaten and broken, retains the capability to strike back with technological sophistication that matches or exceeds German capabilities. And most troubling of all for Wehrmacht commanders trying to maintain offensive momentum toward Moscow, the fear that this new weapon won't be a one-time encounter, but the beginning of something that will multiply across the Eastern Front until that terrible wailing sound becomes the soundtrack of German retreat.
The weapon that destroyed Oberst Müller's column in 15 seconds had been conceived in absolute secrecy 3 years earlier, when Soviet rocket scientists proposed mounting multiple launch rails on truck chassis to create mobile artillery that could deliver massed fires without the weight and complexity of conventional howitzers. The BM-13 design emerged from the Reactive Scientific Research Institute in Moscow, where engineers solved the fundamental problem of rocket artillery, achieving sufficient accuracy to be tactically useful while maintaining the rapid-fire capability that made rockets attractive in the first place. Their solution was elegant and devastating. Rather than trying to make individual rockets precise, which Soviet metallurgy and guidance technology couldn't achieve reliably, they designed a system that saturated target areas with so many rockets that individual accuracy became irrelevant. The math was brutal and effective. If a single 132mm rocket had a circular error probable of 300 meters at maximum range, making it useless for precision strikes, 16 rockets fired simultaneously created an impact pattern that guaranteed complete coverage of a 200-meter target area. When 7 launchers fired in coordinated sequence, that coverage density increased to levels that exceeded anything conventional artillery could achieve. Each BM-13 launcher consisted of 16 rails mounted on a rotating frame attached to a modified ZIS-6 truck chassis, with simple electrical firing circuits that could launch all 16 rockets in 7 to 10 seconds. The rockets themselves were masterpieces of simple but effective design. A steel tube containing solid propellant, a high-explosive warhead, and a simple impact fuse that functioned reliably under field conditions. No complex guidance systems, no delicate electronics. Just enough engineering sophistication to make the weapon work consistently while remaining simple enough that Soviet factories could manufacture thousands of rockets per week. Captain Flyerov's battery represented the first deployment of this weapon system under combat conditions, a field test that would determine whether the Katyusha concept justified the resources required for mass production and deployment across the Red Army's artillery divisions. As Flyerov's launchers empty their rails onto the German column at Rudnya, his crews immediately begin the critical post-firing procedure that defines Katyusha tactics, rapid displacement to avoid German counter-battery fire. The doctrine is simple and inflexible. Fire the entire salvo, then move at least 5 kilometers within 15 minutes before German artillery observers can calculate the launch position and direct retaliatory fires. The BM-13's truck-mounted design makes this tactic practical in ways that conventional artillery cannot match. A standard Soviet 122mm howitzer battery requires approximately 45 minutes to displace after firing, limber the guns, hitch them to their towing vehicles, organize the ammunition and support vehicles, then move to a new position where the entire process reverses. A Katyusha battery completes the displacement in the time it takes the trucks to start their engines and drive away, leaving behind only scorch marks from rocket motor exhaust and empty launch rails. Flyerov's vehicles are in motion within 4 minutes of firing their last rockets, their drivers racing along pre-surveyed routes through the forest that keep them concealed from aerial observation.
By the time German artillery observers could theoretically calculate the launch position and request counter-battery fires, Fleyerov's battery is already 6 kilometers away, reloading rockets from supply trucks that meet them at a pre-designated position. The tactical implications revolutionize Soviet artillery doctrine. For the first time, Red Army forces possess a weapon system that can deliver devastating massed fires against German concentrations, then evade retaliation through speed and mobility. This capability addresses one of the Soviet military's fundamental weaknesses during the opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa: the inability to concentrate artillery fires effectively without losing those batteries to German counter-battery missions or rapid armored advances that overrun static gun positions. The Katyusha solves both problems simultaneously, providing shock firepower equivalent to a conventional artillery battalion while maintaining mobility that rivals German panzer units.
Within 48 hours of the Rudnya strike, detailed reports reached the Soviet High Command describing the results of Fleyerov's attack. The intelligence assessment compiled by Red Army artillery specialists notes the complete destruction of the German vehicle column, estimated casualties exceeding 100 killed and twice that number wounded, and, most importantly, the psychological effect observed by Soviet scouts who monitored German radio traffic after the attack. Wehrmacht units throughout the sector immediately dispersed their vehicle concentrations and suspended daytime resupply operations in areas potentially exposed to artillery observation. The mere existence of the Katyusha had forced German forces to adopt defensive measures that degraded their operational tempo and created friction in their logistics system. This psychological multiplier effect, where a weapon's reputation forces enemy tactical adjustments beyond what the weapon's actual capabilities strictly require, becomes one of the Katyusha's most valuable characteristics. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov immediately recognizes the strategic value of rapid Katyusha deployment and orders the formation of dedicated Guards mortar units equipped exclusively with BM-13 launchers, with each unit consisting of 36 launchers organized into 4 batteries of 7 launchers plus battery headquarters. These units receive elite status within the Red Army structure, with Guards designation normally reserved for formations that distinguish themselves in combat. The name Guards Mortar represents deliberate deception, using terminology that suggests conventional mortar weapons rather than revealing the existence of rocket artillery to German intelligence. By September 1941, just 2 months after Fleyerov's initial strike at Rudnya, 8 Guards mortar regiments have been formed and deployed across the Eastern Front, each capable of delivering devastating rocket barrages that transform local tactical situations within minutes. The production priority assigned to Katyusha launchers and rockets rivals the emphasis on tank production, with Soviet factories delivering approximately 600 BM-13 launchers by the end of 1941, despite the massive industrial disruptions caused by German advances that forced entire factories to relocate east of the Urals. The German response to this new threat reveals both Wehrmacht adaptability and the limitations of responding to Soviet mass production capabilities. Intelligence officers compile reports from survivors of Katyusha strikes, attempting to develop tactical countermeasures and identify the weapon's vulnerabilities. The analysis correctly identifies the basic characteristics: truck-mounted rocket launchers firing massed salvos, then displacing rapidly before counter-battery fire can be directed against them. Wehrmacht tactical doctrine adapts quickly, with directives emphasizing vehicle dispersion, prohibition of large stationary concentrations within 15 kilometers of the front line, and aggressive patrol operations to identify and destroy Katyusha batteries before they can fire. German artillery units develop procedures for rapid counter-battery fire within 90 seconds of detecting rocket launches, hoping to catch Soviet launchers before they complete their displacement. But these countermeasures cannot fully negate the Katyusha threat because they address symptoms rather than the fundamental problem. Soviet factories produce rocket launchers and ammunition faster than German forces can destroy them, while the Katyusha's tactical mobility make them extraordinarily difficult targets for conventional counter-battery methods. A German artillery battery can suppress a Soviet gun position with carefully planned counter-battery fire, but only if that position remains static long enough for fire direction calculations and shell delivery. The Katyusha refuses to cooperate with this tactical model, appearing suddenly to deliver its payload, then vanishing before German gunners can respond effectively.
By the end of 1941, Wehrmacht situation reports routinely reference Stalin's organ attacks as a significant tactical concern, with German soldiers giving the weapon its distinctive nickname for the screaming sound the rockets make during flight, a sound that resembles a massive pipe organ played by a demented musician. That nickname captures both the weapon's terrifying acoustic signature and its psychological impact. German soldiers learn to recognize that distinctive rising wail and know they have perhaps 3 seconds to find cover before the impacts begin, 3 seconds that usually prove insufficient to save themselves if they're caught in the open.
Soviet rocket production transforms from experimental priority to industrial warfare by spring 1942, with factories producing 3,000 BM-13 launchers and over 12 million rockets by the end of that year. This production scale represents one of the most remarkable achievements of Soviet wartime industry, taking a weapon system from first combat deployment to mass production in less than 12 months, while simultaneously evacuating factories eastward to escape German advances. The Katyusha's simple design proves perfectly suited for rapid mass production because it doesn't require sophisticated machining or rare materials. The launcher rails can be fabricated from standard steel stock using basic welding techniques. The ZIS-6 trucks already roll off assembly lines for other military applications. The rockets themselves use relatively simple metallurgy and chemical propellants that Soviet industry can manufacture in quantity despite raw material shortages. Engineers deliberately avoided complex guidance systems or delicate electronics that would create production bottlenecks, instead relying on saturation fire doctrine that trades individual rocket accuracy for overwhelming volume. This design philosophy, prioritizing quantity and reliability over precision and sophistication, defines Soviet weapons development throughout the war and proves devastatingly effective against German forces that often field superior individual weapons but cannot match Soviet production volumes. By 1943, Guards mortar units deploy across every major front, from Leningrad to the Caucasus, with Katyusha batteries becoming standard components of Soviet offensive operations. The tactical employment evolves beyond the opportunistic strikes like Flyorov's attack at Rudnya into carefully choreographed barrages integrated with infantry advances and armor attacks. A typical Soviet offensive begins with Katyusha batteries firing preparatory barrages that saturate German forward positions, destroying communication lines, suppressing defensive fires, and most importantly, creating the psychological shock that leaves defenders stunned and disoriented during the critical first minutes of an attack. The coordination between Katyusha strikes and ground assault forces becomes increasingly sophisticated, with artillery observers directing rocket fires onto specific targets while infantry formations advance behind the rolling barrage. The Battle of Stalingrad in late 1942 demonstrates the Katyusha's evolution from experimental weapon to integral component of Soviet combined arms operations. During the November counteroffensive that encircles German forces, 9 Guards mortar regiments participate in the preparatory bombardment, delivering over 80,000 rockets onto German defensive positions in the span of 30 minutes. The density of this bombardment exceeds anything conventional artillery can achieve, approximately 2,600 rockets per minute across a 40-kilometer front, creating an almost continuous roar of explosions that eyewitnesses describe as resembling sustained earthquake or volcanic eruption. German defenders who survive this barrage report the complete breakdown of command and control during the strikes, with communication trenches collapsed, telephone lines severed, ammunition dumps destroyed by secondary explosions, and above all, the psychological effect of sustained terror as wave after wave of rockets impact without pause or respite. One German lieutenant's diary, recovered after the battle, describes the Katyusha barrage with language that reveals the weapon's psychological impact. The screaming begins at dawn and continues for what feels like hours, but probably only minutes. Each wave brings new terror because you know the rockets cannot be aimed precisely, which means survival is pure chance. The man beside you might be shredded by fragments while you escape untouched, not because of anything you did right or he did wrong, but simply because the random pattern spared you and killed him. This is not warfare. This is industrial murder delivered from invisible launchers that vanish before our artillery can respond. That psychological dimension,
The feeling of helplessness against an enemy weapon that strikes without warning and vanishes before retaliation becomes possible corrodes Wehrmacht morale in ways that conventional artillery never achieves. German soldiers can endure sustained artillery bombardment because their training provides techniques for survival and maintains the belief that their own artillery will eventually suppress enemy guns. The Katyusha offers no such comfort. It appears unpredictably, delivers overwhelming violence, then disappears before countermeasures can be implemented.
By 1944, Soviet rocket artillery deployment reaches industrial scale, with 520 Guards mortar regiments fielding over 10,000 launchers of various types, including the original BM-13, the lighter BM-8 firing 82mm rockets, and the devastating BM-31 firing 300mm rockets designed specifically for demolishing German fortifications. The largest single Katyusha barrage of the war occurs during Operation Bagration in June 1944, when Soviet forces launched their massive offensive to liberate Belarus. The preparatory bombardment employs 400 Katyusha batteries, firing an estimated 120,000 rockets in 15 minutes onto German defensive positions across a 500-kilometer front. This concentration creates a fire density of 240 rockets per minute per kilometer of front, an intensity that simply overwhelms German defensive preparations, regardless of the strength of their fortifications or the discipline of their troops. German after-action reports from surviving units describe defensive positions that ceased to exist as coherent tactical entities after Katyusha strikes, with communications severed, weapons disabled by fragmentation damage, and personnel either casualties or too shocked to offer effective resistance when Soviet infantry arrives. The psychological effect extends beyond the immediate target area as German forces throughout the Eastern Front learn to fear that distinctive wailing sound, knowing it announces incoming destruction against which individual courage or tactical skill offers no protection. Wehrmacht morale reports from 1944 consistently reference Stalin's organ attacks as one of the most feared aspects of Eastern Front combat, ranking alongside Soviet armor concentrations and winter weather as factors that undermine German soldiers' will to fight. The strategic impact of the Katyusha extends far beyond its direct military effect, because it forces fundamental changes in German tactical doctrine that create operational friction throughout Wehrmacht operations. The requirement to disperse vehicle concentrations means German logistics become more complex and time-consuming. Prohibitions on stationary concentrations near the front lines force command posts and supply points further rearward, degrading communication efficiency and response times. The need for aggressive counter-battery operations diverts artillery resources from supporting offensive operations to defensive counterfire missions that rarely achieve success against mobile Katyusha batteries. These cumulative effects represent exactly the type of systemic degradation that Soviet industrial warfare strategy aims to achieve, using mass-produced weapons to impose costs on German operations that erode Wehrmacht effectiveness even when individual Katyusha strikes don't achieve spectacular tactical results. By war's end, Soviet factories have produced approximately 10,000 Katyusha launchers and over 16 million rockets, delivering more than 60,000 tons of high explosives onto German positions through a weapon system that didn't exist in operational form when Operation Barbarossa began. The transformation from Captain Flieroff's 7 experimental launchers at Rudnya to 500,000 soldier Guards mortar force by 1945 represents one of the most dramatic weapons development and deployment success stories of World War II, proving that simple designs optimized for mass production and rapid deployment can achieve strategic effects that rival or exceed more sophisticated weapons that cannot be manufactured in sufficient quantities or deployed with sufficient speed to affect the course of combat operations.
The long-term psychological impact of Katyusha rocket artillery on Wehrmacht forces becomes fully apparent during the final year of the war, when German defensive positions face sustained Soviet offensives supported by massive rocket bombardments. Veteran German soldiers develop a distinctive behavioral pattern that military psychologists would later identify as conditioned fear response, an involuntary physical reaction to the sound of approaching rockets that overwhelms conscious control and training.
Even experienced combat veterans who maintain composure under conventional artillery fire report uncontrollable trembling and difficulty breathing when they hear the rising wail of incoming Katyushas. This response stems from the weapon's unpredictability and the helplessness soldiers feel when targeted by rocket barrages. Conventional artillery follows predictable patterns. Rounds arrive in sequence, allowing soldiers to time their movements between impacts and maintain some illusion of control over their survival. Katyusha rockets arrive in massed waves that offer no gaps for evasive action, no patterns to anticipate, no techniques for improving survival odds beyond pure chance. The psychological literature on combat stress suggests that perceived control over dangerous situations significantly affects soldiers' ability to maintain combat effectiveness under fire. The Katyusha systematically destroys that perception of control, leaving German soldiers with the knowledge that survival depends entirely on random distribution of rocket impacts rather than tactical skill, quick reflexes, or proper use of cover. This learned helplessness corrodes unit cohesion and fighting spirit in ways that conventional weapons rarely achieve. German officers' reports from 1944-45 frequently reference rocket psychosis among troops who have endured sustained Katyusha bombardments, a condition characterized by extreme startle responses to any sudden noise, reluctance to remain in forward positions during daylight when rocket batteries typically fire preparatory bombardments, and declining combat effectiveness as soldiers prioritize self-preservation over mission accomplishment. The weapon's influence extends beyond immediate combat effects to shape post-war military doctrine across multiple nations who study Soviet rocket artillery employment and conclude that massed rocket fire represents a fundamental innovation in fire support techniques. The United States develops the M50 Ontos and various truck-mounted rocket systems inspired directly by Katyusha design principles. The Soviet Union continues expanding rocket artillery capabilities throughout the Cold War, fielding increasingly sophisticated systems like the BM-21 Grad and BM-27 Uragan that multiply the destructive power of the original BM-13 while maintaining the core concept: mobile platforms delivering massed rocket salvos, then displacing before counter-battery fire can respond. China develops its own extensive rocket artillery forces based on captured Katyusha systems and Soviet technical assistance. Even Western armies that initially dismissed rocket artillery as imprecise and wasteful compared to conventional howitzers eventually adopt multiple rocket launcher systems after recognizing the tactical and psychological advantages of massed saturation fires. The doctrinal lesson proves enduring. When properly employed against area targets like vehicle concentrations, supply points, or infantry formations in assembly areas, rocket artillery delivers effects that conventional artillery cannot match. Immediate saturation of large target areas, minimal warning time for defenders, and psychological shock that disrupts enemy operations beyond the physical destruction achieved by the warheads themselves. Modern militaries continue employing multiple rocket launcher systems as standard components of artillery organizations, with current systems like the M270 MLRS and M142 HIMARS demonstrating the continuing relevance of concepts that Soviet designers pioneered with the BM-13 Katyusha in 1941.
Captain Ivan Floyarov, whose experimental battery fired the first combat Katyusha barrage at Rudnya, died in action on October 7, 1941, near Vyazma, when his battery was overrun by German armored forces during the fighting around Moscow. According to NKVD reports, Floyarov and his surviving crew members destroyed their remaining launchers with demolition charges to prevent capture, then fought as infantry until they were killed. His sacrifice ensured that German intelligence did not capture intact Katyusha systems during the critical early months of the weapon's deployment, maintaining Soviet technological advantage until production scaled to levels where individual launcher losses became tactically insignificant. Floyarov received posthumous recognition as a hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest military decoration, for his role in developing Katyusha employment tactics and for maintaining security protocols that protected the weapon's secrets. His name appears on monuments at Rudnya and at the Artillery Museum in St. Petersburg, commemorating the artillery officer who transformed an experimental rocket launcher into the weapon that German soldiers learned to fear more than almost any other Soviet weapon system. The German soldiers who survived Katyusha strikes throughout the war carried physical and psychological scars that persisted decades after the conflict ended. Veterans' accounts from the 1960s and 1970s consistently reference the terror of rocket bombardments as one of the most traumatic experiences of their military service, with many describing nightmares triggered by sirens or other rising-pitch sounds that evoked memories of incoming Katyushas. The distinctive acoustic signature that led German soldiers to nickname the weapon Stalin's organ became permanently associated with helplessness and terror in the memories of men who heard it under combat conditions. Medical studies of Wehrmacht veterans who served on the Eastern Front show significantly higher rates of post-traumatic stress symptoms compared to veterans of other theaters, with sustained exposure to Katyusha bombardments identified as one of several factors contributing to long-term psychological trauma. The weapon's legacy thus extends beyond its direct military impact to include the human cost of industrial warfare, the psychological destruction inflicted on soldiers who faced weapons designed not just to kill efficiently, but to terrorize completely. That terror served Soviet strategic objectives by undermining Wehrmacht morale and degrading German combat effectiveness through means that extended beyond physical casualties to attack the psychological resilience that armies require to sustain offensive operations under adverse conditions. In that sense, the Katyusha achieved exactly what its designers intended, not merely destroying German forces through explosive fragmentation, but breaking their will to fight through the application of overwhelming violence delivered with such speed and unpredictability that human psychology could not adapt or accommodate. By May 1945, when Soviet forces entered Berlin under continuous Katyusha support that reduced German defensive positions to rubble, the weapon that had first appeared at Rudnya 4 years earlier had become synonymous with Soviet military power and with the terrible price of Germany's decision to invade the Soviet Union. The ruins of Berlin bore testament to the strategic consequences of underestimating Soviet industrial capacity and technological innovation, consequences that began with 7 experimental launchers destroying a supply column in a small marketplace and ended with thousands of launchers delivering millions of rockets onto the shattered capital of the Third Reich. The journey from that first 15-second barrage to the final bombardments that preceded Soviet infantry's assault on the Reichstag represents one of World War II's most dramatic demonstrations of how simple weapons, optimized for mass production and rapid deployment, can achieve strategic effects that rival the impact of more sophisticated systems. The Katyusha proved that in industrial warfare, quantity combined with mobility and shock effect can overcome individual weapon superiority, and that the psychological dimension of combat represents a battlefield as important as the physical terrain where armies maneuver and fight. German soldiers who heard that rising wail for the first time at Rudnya in July 1941 could not have imagined that the sound would follow them in retreat across thousands of kilometers, growing louder and more frequent with each passing year, until it became the sound of inevitable defeat echoing through the streets of their capital city as the Third Reich collapsed into history.